Hi, I'm Rachel from Skulls and Satin, and this is the sew along video tutorial for the Carly Cardi Coat. This pattern is designed for upcycled fabrics, so vintage quilts, vintage blankets, vintage wool blankets, woven tapestry blankets, any kind of blanket or secondhand fabric. If you prefer to use new, you can use any kind of quilted or thick blanket fabric. The Carly is a boxy oversized coat. It's open with patch pockets, a drop shoulder, and kimono sleeves. It's a super adaptable pattern. You can customize it however you like. You can add button closures or ties. You can change the pocket shape. You can change the length of the pattern. I've made it from a crop coat all the way to a long duster. I will make a second video with pattern hacks showing you how to do that, but for the sew along tutorial, we're just doing the basic pattern today. It's a fairly quick and simple sew designed for confident beginners to intermediate. We're using bias finishing for all the inside seams, which gives a really beautiful, professionally finished look. If you want to skip that and make it even more beginner friendly, you can just serge the raw edges. So that's up to you. I'm going to break it down really easy and show you how to do the bias tape. So I recommend that, but whatever you like. I think that's it. Let's get started. Here's my pattern printed out and taped together. I will be using the medium-large size to make my coat. I'm lining my pattern up on the blanket right side up, making sure both fronts are aligned with the blanket edge, so I'll have a mirror image. And then the sleeve aligned with the blanket edge. The back piece I'll trace off half and then flip it over so we've got one continuous piece, and then make sure the other sleeve lines up with the blanket edge. For the pockets first, we will serge just the diagonal edge of each pocket. We'll flip that to the wrong side and turn up the edge 3/4 of an inch and press that in place. Do the same on both pockets. Sew the pocket edge down starting at the edge of the pocket and continuing all the way until the other edge. Turn it to the wrong side again, give it a press, and then we will turn up all the other pocket edges 3/8 of an inch and press in place. Now pin the pockets to the front pieces, making a mirror image and being really careful that they are placed equal distances from the front edges and the bottom edges. Sew the pockets onto the front, back stitching at the beginning and end. Sew down the pocket, and when you come to the corner, leave your needle in, lift the presser foot and pivot the fabric. Then put your presser foot back down and continue sewing along the edge of the pocket. And repeat the same thing when you come to the other corners. Leave your needle down in the fabric, lift the presser foot, pivot the fabric, put the foot back down, and continue sewing along the edge of the pocket. Continue this until you come to the end of the pocket. For a double stitching line, when you get to the one edge of the pocket, pivot, go across 3 stitches, pivot again, and then just stitch beside your original stitching line, the width of the presser foot around the rest of the pocket. When you come to the last edge of the pocket, you're just going to pivot your needle and then back stitch to join your original stitch line. For the next seam, we're going to place the wrong sides together and pin that short little seam in place. Sew the seam back stitching at the beginning and end of the seam. Now press the seam open. Cut a piece of bias tape the length of the seam and press up one end 1/2 inch. Lay the center of the bias tape aligned with the center of the seam and also match the folded edge with the clean finished blanket edge. Place pins down the middle of the bias tape, pinning it to the seam right in the middle of the seam. Starting at the raw edge, we'll sew down one side of the tape all the way down the edge. When you get to the edge, leave your needle down, lift the presser foot, and turn the fabric, and then sew the folded tape down and backstitch when you come to the other side. Now sew down the other side of the tape. If you didn't mark the center back notch when you cut out your fabric, mark it now. With the right sides together, align the front and back pieces at the center back, and then align along each shoulder seam and pin or clip in place. Where the shoulder seam meets the neck seam, we're going to pin there and then pivot the fabric and follow along the neckline curve. Sew the shoulder seam starting at one edge. When you come to the end of the shoulder seam, you're going to leave your needle down in the fabric, lift the presser foot, pivot the fabric, put the presser foot back down, and then continue sewing along the neck edge. We'll do the same thing when we come to the other shoulder seam. We will leave the needle down, lift the presser foot, pivot the fabric, put the foot down, and then continue sewing the rest of the shoulder seam. Now press the whole shoulder and neck seam open. Piece of bias tape the length of the shoulder seam. Using the same process we did for the neck seam, center the bias tape over the middle of the seam and pin it in place. When you get to the point where the neck and shoulder seams meet, you're going to pin directly on the point, and then we will curve the tape around and continue pinning it around the neck seam. Repeat that when you come to the next point, pin there, and then curve the tape around and continue pinning down the center. You'll notice where the seams meet at the bottom of the bias tape, there's excess fabric. We're just going to fold it towards the center back, make a little pleat, and pin that in place so it lays flat while we sew it. And repeat that process on the other corner, folding it towards the center back, making a little pleat, and pinning that in place. Sew down the bias tape starting at the top edge or the edge without the pleats, going around the top of the corners and sewing to the other edge. Now sew down the bottom edge of the bias tape. When you come to the other pleat, you'll leave your needle down, lift your presser foot, turn your fabric, put the presser foot back down, and then continue sewing along the bottom edge of the tape. Repeat this when you come to the other pleat as well. Press the bias tape. Put the right side of the coat body and the sleeve together and pin along the edge. Sew the coat body and sleeve seam. Press the seam open. Take a piece of bias tape the length of the seam and using the same process as before, center it over the seam and pin it in place all the way down the seam. Sew one edge of the bias tape down. And then sew the other edge down. Repeat the whole process for the other sleeve. With the right sides together, line up the edges of the coat from the sleeve all the way down the side to the bottom. Pin or clip in place. Now sew the side seam from the sleeve edge all the way along down the coat to the bottom edge. Cut a length of bias tape the length of the seam plus an inch. Unfold the bias tape lining up the edge with the seam edge. Also leave your 1/2 inch of bias tape hanging over the sleeve edge. You're going to sew on the bias tape just inside the original side seam, all the way down the coat to the very bottom, and remember to leave an extra 1/2 inch hanging off the bottom when you come to the end. Fold the bias tape over to cover the seam, and at the sleeve edge, fold in that extra 1/2 inch of bias tape and pin in place. Now you're just going to continue folding the bias tape over the seam the whole way down the side seam. And when you come to the bottom, do the same thing you did at the sleeve edge. Fold up the 1/2 inch and pin in place so that the raw edges will get enclosed in the sewing. Sew the bias tape down along the whole length of the seam. Now press the bias bound seam towards the back of the coat along the whole length of the seam, including the sleeve. Turn the coat right side out and you are done. To bind the outside edge of the coat, we're going to place the bias tape on the wrong side of the fabric along the edge with the edges lined up. Leave a couple extra inches of bias tape and then start sewing on about 2 inches from the center back. and you're gonna sew just inside the bias tape fold all around the whole edge of the coat. For the corners, when you get close to the edge, you're going to stop sewing 1/2 inch from the edge. Backstitch at this point, and then completely take your fabric out of the machine. Now turn your fabric to continue sewing down the other edge. We're going to take the bias tape and make a little diagonal fold, folding the bias tape back on itself so that the bias tape continues along the edge. This is a close-up of the bias tape fold. So you're just folding it back on itself, and then you can see the folded edge is kind of a triangle. So you're lining up the bias tape to continue along the next edge, and you're going to start sewing at the point you stopped on the last edge. So continue sewing around the bottom of the coat. And we'll do the same thing at the other corner. Stop sewing 1/2 inch from the edge, turn your fabric, fold the bias tape back on itself, and then start sewing again around the same point that you left off. Continue sewing the bias tape on all the way around the coat until you get a few inches away from the center back seam. Now take the coat out of the machine, and you're just going to lay the bias tape flat and mark the point where it meets that seam on both pieces of bias tape. Now we will line up the bias tape at those points, and we will sew a seam there and then trim off all the excess bias tape. Now press that little seam on the bias tape open, and if you need to press your edge up, do so. Lay the bias tape flat along the edge and sew it down. Now we will flip the coat over to the right side and flip the bias tape so it folds over the raw edge and covers the stitching line. We will do this around the whole edge of the coat and just pin it in place as you go. When you come to the corner, trim off any loose threads, and because of the way we sewed it, when you fold it over to the right side, it just makes a really nice mitered corner almost. So you have to just fold one edge in and then fold the other one over, and it makes a really beautiful diagonal shape. So you're just going to fold that in place and pin. Now flip the coat around and continue along the next edge, folding the bias tape over the raw edges and pinning in place. Sometimes at the side seams, there's a little extra bulk that I trim away just if the bias tape won't fold over nicely. And again, when you get to the other corner, you're just going to fold up one side and then fold in the other, and it makes that nice, crisp diagonal corner. Keep pinning the bias tape all the way around the coat until you come to the point where you started. Now sew the bias tape down, starting at that center back seam. Sew it down all the way around the whole coat. And when you come to the corner, you're going to sew to the edge of the tape, leave your needle down, lift the presser foot up, turn your fabric around, put the presser foot back down, and continue on sewing. And repeat the corner step when you get to the other corner. And continue sewing the bias tape on until you come to that point where you started. Now give the edges a good press all the way around the whole coat. Cut a piece of bias tape the width of the sleeve plus 1/2 inch. Unfold the bias tape and join both ends together. Sew them with a 1/4 inch seam. Press the seam open, and then if you need to, press the bias folds back into place. Lay the bias tape inside the sleeve with the edges aligned and pin it in place all around the sleeve edge. Now sew the bias tape to the sleeve from the inside, sewing just inside the bias fold. Pull the bias tape to the outside, and then we will fold it over the raw edge and pin it in place. Pin it in place just so it covers your original stitching line. Sew the bias tape down around the sleeve edge on the right side all the way around, shifting the fabric as you go. Now press the sleeve edge all the way around. You are done your coat with bound edges and bound cuffs. Thanks for sewing with me, and hope you love your new coat.